Our presenter today is Mark Hutson, CMIR, CPSM, C.P.M, Manager of Asset Control and Recovery at the Mosaic Company. Mosaic is the world's leading integrated producer and marketer of crop nutrients. Mark has a degree in building construction from the University of North Florida and a Master's of Business Administration from the University of Tampa. He has over 30 years of industrial and construction experience, from hands-on field support to corporate administration. He worked his way through school as a co-op in electric utilities, where he began a rooted understanding of industrial operations. Noticing the lack of dedicated resources to centralized oversight of obsolete and surplus assets at Mosaic, he was provided with an opportunity to cultivate an investment recovery program. Within 3 years, the program harvested triple its initial revenue. In their home state of Florida, Mark and his childhood sweetheart, his wife Nancy, are avid outdoors adventurers. They have 3 sons, Dart, Adam, and Patrick. You can look forward to the following key takeaways from today's presentation: the basics of asset dispositioning, the 7 R's of investment recovery, the sales contract, and contract administration. Now let's get started. Mark, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks again for taking your time, and hopefully we can provide you some nice takeaways so you can add value to your organization. Our hopes in delivering this higher level overview and academic examination of the process of asset disposition is that you can take it back to the hands-on day-to-day tasks that then add value to your organization. This program universally applies, and we have some examples of how they can apply to real world later on. And most of this information comes from the Investment Recovery Handbook, Adding Value to the Supply Chain, which I encourage you to read primarily so that you can, again, add that value to your organizations. And it is also the primary study guide for the professional certification of Certified Manager of Investment Recovery. So as we get started today, dispositioning is the very heart of investment recovery. What we want to do here is, of course, maximize the economic return, minimize risk through compliance with all legal, statutory, and regulatory requirements, and provide customer satisfaction for our internal and external clients. So as we go through this deck, we want to keep in mind that it's the most dollars for the smallest risk to make people happy. And it's good to put our thoughts in to a process so it's methodical. And as we take a look at each one of the steps, we put it in a sequence diagram here. So, and again, I don't want to get the cart before the horse, because at the tail end of this is the disposition portion that we'll be examining in depth. But it's very important to understand how this whole sequence works. And again, the whole sequence of disposition applies to all activities of this, one piece of machinery or an entire plant. So we'll go from identifying to adding value to the disposition portion of it. Digging a little bit deeper to the bubble diagrams to identify, the first thing we want to do is locate the items. So there's truly the first step of it, and it may, as simple as that may sound, opportunities are found in lots of different ways. Then we want to describe it, and that's teeing up pretty much the entire process, because not only describing it, but adding serial numbers and plenty of other identifiers so people can know exactly what they're diving into. And of course, to catalog it. And it's important to catalog it because as we get further down the sequence diagram, we're going to see that, of course, you wouldn't go to a feed store looking for hair gel. And if you put the different assets in different categories, it's much easier to find market channels for them. The next portion is the valuation. Now, this part in the sequence diagram really describes how someone would even choose where to dive into these murky waters of asset recovery. There are whole industries that specialize in this arena, whether they're appraisers, auctioneers, brokers, trade magazines, and Kelley Blue Books. As we follow that again, we have a value concept, a value approach, and then the value reconciliation. Then we get into the disposition. That's what we've all come to this presentation to learn about. The first step in that is developing a contacts, and that's a database. And I'd like to give an unabashed plug for the Investment Recovery Trade Show on April 19th and 22nd in Scottsdale, Arizona, because myself, that's where I've truly gained a lot of contacts and my database from meeting the people there at that trade show, and then it all kind of networks from that. The next is the options, and that's kind of the meat and potatoes of what we'll get into with this presentation. And finally, the closeout portion of it. And most of that's going to focus on documentation. Like they used to say in the fire service, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So we get into our contacts. Now, as we move, further into the sequence diagram, into our disposition bubble, the first module is going to be this contacts. While it's intuitive for everybody, of course, you're going to have contacts, but again, it's how to classify and discuss each one of these. We want to develop and maintain the customer base of prospective buyers and sellers, and develop your clients and organize in some sort of classification and commodity codes system. And there's plenty of ways to break down the different seller platforms between buyers and organized, and to organize it. Finding prospective customers under this. Suggestions from the asset owner, for myself, I found to be really, really helpful in developing, finding who the SMEs, the subject matter experts are in your company. And for example, for us, there is a whole world associated with just drag lines, and there's only a couple of people that really understand where they play out worldwide. And another specialized field will be like locomotives. And I'm sure you can think about different examples within your company where things can be very, very specialized. Kind of reminds me of a funny story when I was getting into finding out how to disposition pallets at one time. I actually got a hold through another organization I'm involved in with a grocery store, and they have one guy that just deals with dispositioning pallets, and he understands all the different woods that are involved with it, all the different nails that are involved with it, all the different bugs that may get into pallets and things like that. Of course, the purchasing department, they have their thumb on the pulse of all the vendors and the commerce that's going on in your organization. Vendor assistance, and we'll get into some other examples of reversing supply chains then also. Fellow investment recovery professionals, there's cold calls, telephone directories, trade publications, Thomas Register, again, back to the trade shows, and internet searches. The 7 R's. The 7 R's are the investment recovery law. It's kind of like the Boy Scout law of trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. These 7 R's are to investment recovery. It kind of slides down the scale again, and we have reuse, recondition, return, resell, reclaim, recycle, and remove. It's so important, I'm going to say it again. Reuse, recondition, return, resell, reclaim, recycle, and remove. Again, I would kind of like to put everything in diagrams and get a good concept here of the value that it adds. Of course, at the very, very top of our scale is a reuse, provides the most value for us as we slide on down the scale to remove, and that's throwing it away. I really kind of want to dive in here too is now who's kind of responsible for each one of these roles, because as an investment recovery practitioner, you only tend to think of yourself as, oh, when it ends up in my lap, it's the resell factor. But it's really how much we can be influencers up at the reuse, because let's say that's probably more engineering and operations would find a way to reuse it and recondition it. But if we can influence that mindset of, let's just not throw the baby out with the bathwater, have it sit out in the field, I can't necessarily use it, or go directly to resell, we can influence the reuse and recondition because it adds more value. Now, once we get down to return, that's more of a procurement function. But again, we can influence that sort of thinking when, instead of somebody just saying, hey, I'll put it in the attic and hopefully one day I'll find a value for it. There's more value in making that return for it instead of just sitting around and rusting. Then once we get to the resell, kind of reclaim and recycle, that's much more in the investment recoveries wheelhouse. But, as you see where it slides on down the scale, not as much value. And then we get into the remove portion of it, and that's primarily more environmental concerns because it's going to a landfill. But of course, we have a green initiative too that we want to make sure that we're not just filling up the landfills as we go about. The types of surplus, we'll dive into this. The types of surplus, the capital assets, non-capital, MRO, which are mainly parts, the maintenance, repair, and operating assets. Excess product and raw materials, physically obsolete, accounting obsolete, and byproducts and waste. I have a pretty good story here about what we thought was product and waste as pipe was wearing out for the mining operations that we had. We were pretty much sending that to the recycler and melting it down because to us, it didn't necessarily act as pipe anymore. But as we started exploring it and again, kind of reversing our supply chains through our pipe supplier, we actually found a use for the pipe. A lot of flood farmers in southern Florida wanted to move water in the sugarcane fields. And thin pipe was fine for them. It didn't have a lot of pressure to it and it was just kind of diverting it. And that gained us about 5 times the amount of our return other than just sending it to the recycler and having it melted down, as well as, of course, the green story to that as well, that we have a better carbon footprint with that. Now, these are related terms and processes. It's important to help our organization speak the same language. We can put this, I put the slide out here because a pipe wrench is called a monkey wrench by some other people. So it's important that we build and speak kind of a common language. Again, I'm kind of thinking about one of my biggest hurdles with the investment recovery program was around the word scrap. A lot of people thought, well, scrap, this part is no good to me anymore, so it is scrap. And they put a big giant red X on it, and red X's are difficult to sell. But trying to change the language as well, there's a difference between scrap, because scrap means that it will no longer provide the function that it is now, but salvage means it can still have a function. So some of the thinking that we changed, instead of a red X, we're putting a giant green check mark on old motors, because they can still be rewound and act as motors, but not necessarily for us. We're going to start going down this our scale again now, as far as kind of describing each one of those and how we can be influencers in these. The reuse, of course, from our scale, was that it provides the highest value. And it's defined as reutilizing or redeployment of surplus assets within a company. And it always provides the greatest potential, which makes bill of materials so valuable, because then we can plug and play in different parts where maybe this exact same part number doesn't work for this, but if it can be tweaked a little bit and moved over to other assets, again, we can get the most reuse out of it and gain the greatest amount of opportunities. The basic steps in creating an effective internal asset redeployment program is identify the company's surplus assets. And again, we go back to our sequence diagram where we talked about identifying items. Make the surplus assets visible within the company and to external customers. Be proactive in promoting the use of surplus assets through redeployment and provide necessary service support. Number 2, on our slide diagram, is reconditioning. Now, it's rebuilding and overhauling equipment for internal use. There is a caveat to this, though, I really want to add, because we get into this a lot then too, is that the cost associated with the repair and refurbishing of processes, they can add up quickly. And not only with the repair and refurbish, but also there's shipping and freight and other intangibles like a clerk doing billing and things along those lines. So being from Florida, the land of oranges, one of our state sayings is the squeeze worth the juice? So something very much to consider. Now, You want to compare these to projected refurbishing costs with current market resale of the items and consider partial refurbishments. And that's kind of like just tweaking the items a little bit. Again, maybe not doing it same functionality, but very similar. The third is return. Now, again, this is more of a procurement-related task, but it's important for us to be influencers here so that items don't come in, hey, it didn't exactly necessarily fit, we'll keep it around, maybe someday we can find some sort of use for it, and worst case, it sits outside and then it's just a bucket of rust until then they realize, oh, I can't use it, and then they bring it to the investment recovery's doorstep for us to sell it and it's junk. That's where we can influence, hey, let's try to get it back to return. There's big open markets for it, particularly with the seller. And even if we have to pay a little bit of restocking fees or things along those lines, we're going to get the most value out of it along those lines. Yeah, and returns have become really so easy nowadays, especially with everything being on electronic and being able to follow. Back in the day, you actually had to have a physical original receipt to get things returned, and it's not really that case anymore. I'm just thinking, my wife shops at Amazon like she's playing a Space Invaders game, pushing the missile button, buying stuff, because she knows as soon as she gets it in, she can feel it, touch it, and just return it that much more quickly. Amazon actually has a dedicated fleet just for her shopping style. And here's one of my public service announcements for the day is don't drink in Prime. Yeah, that's funny. The resell function of it. Now, this is investment recovery practitioners' forte. And it's most important to consider, are there any restrictions on the sale of the assets, licensing, exporting, legal? Is there a time frame in selling these assets? That's a big Sarbanes-Oxley issue because they don't like it for us to write it off and then for it to sit around on our shelves waiting to be sold. And to make sure that it's complete and accurate descriptions, nameplates, databases, back to the sequence diagram, this is the identification portion of what we were talking about. Environmental issues, asbestos, lead, oil, radiation, and identify the most likely targets. And that's truly one of our biggest challenges. And determine the sales method most appropriate and seal bids, spot bids, negotiations, and auctions. So with that said, there's the sale types. We can have third-party sales where we actually go out and find an end user, or dealers and brokers. And again, it's more difficult to find that end user than to utilize a dealer and broker / broker, because really that's their core business, and they have the marketplaces, the market channels in place that an investment recovery practitioner maybe truly can't develop or has the time to develop. And they have their own websites and storefronts essentially for this stuff, and the networks. There's trades and bartering arrangements, donations, and auctions. End user, again, with an end user, you have to do the marketing yourself, and it can be difficult, but it does provide the greatest potential return because there's not a lot of middlemen in between you and the commerce that you're seeking. The brokers and dealers, again, they're able to find a ready, willing, and able buyer much quicker than you, because you're kind of still out there trying to find a lot of the assets. It's important to point out here too, the distinction between a broker and a dealer is generally that a broker does not take title of the asset, whereas the dealer usually takes title. And rebuilders and refurbishers purchase items that need to be rebuilt, repaired, or updated. Lots of places specialize just in that. Arrangements may be involved with the purchase or consignment. And again, that kind of goes back to our reverse supply chains and spare parts. When I keep talking about reversing supply chains, it's a lot of models that I've been able to build. Again, you have a company that says that specializes in conveyor belting. They sell that all the time. And as our belting was wearing out, we have very, very wide belts, 54 inches. And what wears out on a belt is really the sides of it. Well, come to find out, there's a lot of aggregate limestone mines in South Florida, and they deal with 46-inch belts. Well, if we trim 4 inches off of both sides of this worn out belt to us, it still has a lot of good value. And again, the supplier is the one that specializes it, has a shop to do that. So as our belt started wearing out, we send it back to them. They store it on their site, and then we get a commission off of the sales for the used belts. Uh-oh, we're stuck again, Jane. Oh, there we go. Sales methods. There's fixed price sales. Investment representative sets a price for an item and advertise through listings. Again, you're finding the marketplace, and quite often becomes a negotiated sale and can be used in any type of asset. Negotiated sales involve, the classic offer and counter offer, open bids, and auctions kind of can fall into this open bid process as well. And next is auctions and the public sales of the assets to the highest bidder. There's several ways that you can approach these two, but generally auctions are viewed as liquidations and, like a fire sale. So you're not going to get the most value out of it, but you can set absolutes or reserves for the items that you want to sell. And the thing that's really good about auctions is it puts everything out in the sunshine. There's no, hey, this person didn't find out about a particular item that you had for sale. Oh, you could have sold it to somebody else for a lot higher. It's all out there in the sunshine. And then the broker-dealer agreements. Arrangements can be made for exclusive sales. And the good thing about an exclusive basis working to sell a certain asset for you is you generally find the broker or dealer is going to work a lot harder for you because he knows that the rug's not going to get pulled out from underneath him. And now they may not take physical possession of the assets, which can be difficult sometimes with the Sarbanes-Oxley rules that we were talking about earlier. And finally, the sealed bid method. And that does require, a mailing campaign, contacting each one of those qualified buyers, pretty much pre-qualifying them to know that if they do meet the bid requirements, that they will be able to have the cash flow for you. And very, very specific things that need to kind of happen with that. And they tend to be much more confidential and ethical sales processes, but again, makes it difficult to market. And some people kind of find them to be secretive. Other methods that we can look at, of course, is trades and bartering, but it's difficult to really set up a warranty and conditions, valuations, and taxation issues associated with that. Again, very, very important if we're going to get into trades and bartering to document. And much less, I'd rather see cash and gain the time value of the money other than maybe a long-term credit that you could necessarily get in a trades bartering sort of situation. And then donations. Donations are really good, and it's important that the investment recovery practitioner gets involved in that. Even though it may be a zero value, it's the intangibles of the goodwill that can justify the legitimacy of investment recovery. Again, documentation, very important, primarily for taxes, and that we know that it's going to the proper places. And it's important to take a look at the 4 criteria for donations. And that would be a transfer of title to the property. It must be a permissible donee, and a permissible donee is the government or the 501c3 organizations. Be with the donative's intent and meet the rules of substantiation and valuation as defined by the RIS. And that would be that over certain dollars amounts, you'd have to have appraisers and definitions for that. And the American Society of Appraisers define the fair market value as the price at which property would sell between a willing buyer and a willing seller, neither under compulsion to buy or sell, or both having reasonable knowledge of the relevant event. So again, important to keep. Donations can get sticky. More on donations. they have to be acceptable under your corporate policy, so it's important to know what yours is. They must conform to tax laws, product liability release. Again, the documentation is important, as is where is, and even though you're giving it to somebody, it needs to be treated like a sale, and a bill of sale associated with it, even if it's zero value. And donated assets over $5,000 in value will also need to have that appraisal that we talked about. The sales contract that I was just talking about, the bill of sale, it's important that because the sale needs to equal an offer and acceptance and consideration. And sales agreements are unique to each situation. They contain all protections required, and it's important that they have that as is, where is language. And review that with your legal departments. And unnecessarily or unclear contract provisions can lead to confusion and, in the worst case, to litigation. And some people actually kind of like to build the contracts to be like that so they can get into these sticky sort of situations. But like my dad always said, don't wrestle with a pig, because it'll only get you dirty, and the pig likes it. Next on our scale is reclaim and reclamation for reuse. It's a form of recycling with the spent lubricants or chemicals, bunker C oils, wood products can be reclaimed and kind of reused. And there's benefits because there's cost avoidance with sending it to landfills. They can be reused internally, and it tells a very good green story for the investment recovery practitioner as far as the carbon footprint. Next is recycling. Recycling has its benefits, and it truly generates real income and real cash. Some of the problems associated with necessarily recycling is people don't always know what all they can recycle. Of course, everyone knows you recycle metals, and there's cardboards and plastics, pallets as well. And we had a bunch of HDPE plastic pipe. And of course, everyone was understanding, yes, we recycle metal. And that was going for about 7 cents a pound. Whereas the HDPE plastic, actually, we found a recycler in town that we got more than 3 times the amount for it. You grind it up and making truck beds out of it. So again, there's lots of opportunities there for real dollars. Next is then removing the asset. And the remove is going to go, of course, to the landfill, and it's the least desirable disposition method. And we need to use it only as a last resort. And sometimes it's the best option. But I do want to point out under this is that a lot of things require a certified destruction of items. For example, inefficient and old locomotives or engines actually require a destruction certification with punching like large 1-inch holes through the engine blocks of them. Next is in our bubble diagram, as we come around the bottom of the disposition bubble, finally is the closeout section that we're going to discuss. And the job's not done until the paperwork's done. The goal of this is to have positive awareness, sustainability. There's a global reporting initiative along those lines. And the positive awareness is not just so the exec team knows that there's dollars being generated, but it's really, really important that individual contributors are get involved in this, because they can truly be entrepreneurs for you, and they're the ones going out there and identifying potential opportunities. Benchmarking, metrics along those lines, there's the financial, tax, and inventory reductions, that's in the carrying costs associated with those, the operating and the people management, continuous improvements along the closeout portion of it, Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, and let's not forget in the very last one, find time to celebrate our wins, and also not only with ourselves, but other people that have contributed to the entire program. As a recap, can the item be redeployed within the company? That's the first influencer part that we need to be doing within our organizations. And then from there, we'll roll up or roll down the slide diagram to find out where we can best enter and find out a good place to disposition our items. Considerations for that we discussed were value of asset compared to the cost of sale. Can it be refurbished? Environmental and safety concerns, time constraints, and then, of course, the current market impacts for all of this. We looked at sales, negotiated or fixed to higher values, auction options, bids, opened or sealed, scrap sales, group sales, spot sales, trades, bartering, the donations, and making sure it meets all those criteria, or, of course, to remove it cost. So I've been doing a lot of talking, and I'd kind of like to throw these scenarios out so we can kind of take this academic approach and maybe apply it to real world stuff. So it's kind of a quiz we got going. And what I'd encourage you to do is put your answers into the chat box, and Jane will help us tally up some of these. So Jane, you can take it back if you'd like, and I'll keep talking about the quizzes here. The first one I'd like to examine is, let's say we have a turbine or steam generator and it will be removed from service in 6 months. The question here is, what is the first step in the disposition process? And I'll make this multiple choice. Let's say A, find a generator market. B, ID and get the specifications, like the serial numbers of this generator. C, get an appraisal. Or D, find another location to use it. I'll give everybody a few minutes to maybe punch in some chats on that. A, B, C, or D?
So, I have some, not A, B, C, or D, but scrappers would be an option, refurbisher, reuse, resellers, or OEMs themselves, newer buyers.
Nice. Kind of what I did with this is going back to our original sequence diagram where we have, we need to ID it and know exactly what it is so before we can even market it. Let's go on to number 2, filters. Have materials management say we are grossly overstocked with this type of filter. So it's really the question, what is the first steps in determining the disposition? I would go out on a limb here and say the return or return it to the supplier, since we have more than that we need, and obviously we're buying them, so there is a marketplace for them. The last one, number 3, we have a crane, an oldie but a goodie, but it still works and is no longer useful to our operations. What is the first steps in dispositioning? We'd have go to a broker or an auction house, and because it still operates, there still has to be a home for it. It would still function as the asset that it is. That was fun. So to kind of wrap this up, make sure that we understand give you some resources. Bartering Recovery Association is a great resource for you. In the very beginning, I talked about the handbook, adding value to supply chain. And also it's the primary study guide to the professional certifications, and they're available through the Investment Recovery Association or at Amazon.com. Thanks everybody for your time. Jane?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We have some questions for you, Mark.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Okay. How about, can you share how Mosaic calculates their reuse savings?
It reduced savings because then you're comparing it against previous years. Generally, for each transaction that I'm involved in, I'm not comparing that to, say, necessarily private past years, but it's just a total running tally of everything that's all the revenue that's generated through this department on an annual basis. For example, like the HDPE plastic pipe, that was a big one. You really can't take past years of selling at a lower amount versus this year selling at a higher amount, because the quantities aren't going to be the same necessarily. So that's why it all has to be a total tally. And it kind of cheats us investment recovery practitioner a little bit then also, because maybe the same amount of assets aren't available year to year. And then you think, well, if you have a dip, then you're not working as hard as past years. So that's not really always the case. That's why I just try to do a running tally. But along the same lines then too, we did get involved in a program where we were reclaiming and reusing flanges. And there is a cost to buy a new versus what it costs for the fabrication. So you just less out the fabrication and count that as overall recovery and revenue and savings. And it's important too, it's one more thing to that too. It's important as you go to the C-suite with this sort of information, is that a lot of times they want to see it as savings. And I think that's the reason why it was the question was originally posed. This is revenue. It's not savings on the front end of the financial calculator. This is back end actual dollars in the door as far as for investment recovery.
Great. Next question. You mentioned earlier in the presentation a destruction certificate for locomotives. Is there a matrix for assets that cannot be sold as is that you're aware of?
No, nothing like that fully exists. Each item is, regulated in some sort of way, but it's very important that you dig into those regulations for each item. And then also there are environmental impacts on the world.
Right. Thank you. Next question. What do you typically do with an item that costs money to dispose of, such as hazardous waste, solar panels, for example? And then how would you charge clients in order to make a profit off of it, which I know Mosaic, you don't necessarily do that, but how would you handle something like that as an investment recovery professional?
Well, most of this stuff is the stream that it's in is in the removed portion of our slide diagram, and environmental compliance departments or people oversee that portion of it. So really that's more in their world than in the investment recovery world. But again, back to my push to be an influencer, how and if can we pull that material out of that remove and landfill sort of stream, and is it possible? A lot of times, no, not maybe the case, but again, how can we influence the environmental folks to know that's what we've always done with it, and that's the stream it needs to be in.
Okay. Now, I started out the question and answer period with a question on reuse. So the person came back to rephrase, and if you could share, how does Mosaic calculate the cost avoidance savings when reusing an asset internally?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't, because it really hasn't fallen into the realm of investment recovery at that point when it's going to be reused. Again, most of my ability is how to just influence it to go that way instead of it going to wherever else it would. And that, I don't really feel for myself a way of capturing that. that would most likely, again, because it hasn't fallen into the realm of investment recovery yet, that would be at the plant level with the engineer and operations grabbing that cost savings, and primarily directly for their cost center.
Thank you. Seeing the list of attendees on the webinar today, if you have a specific calculation or a process how your company does it within investment recovery, if you could share that with me at jmale@westerneda.com, I'll be glad to share it with our attendee. Thank you. Now, there were several questions about donations, but you answered a few of them during later slides. But could you review the 4 criteria for donations again?
Yes. It was to be a transfer of title on a property, and that's to qualify as a donation. The transfer of title has to go, and ownership must be complete, and the donee must accept and receive the property. They don't want things like services or anything like that necessarily to be where there's nothing physical that could be transferred, and be a permissible donee. And that, I think everyone understands that can either be the government or the 501c3 organizations. And be with the donative's intent, and maybe that's where some people were confused. To meet the test of a donative's intent, the contribution must be voluntary and on the donor and the donee's part, and be without exception of financial benefit in exchange for the contribution. And then the last is meet the rules and substantiation and valuation as defined by IRS. Again, that gets really, really mired with lots of IRS rules. There's no way we could cover that within an hour's time. But mainly that has to do with fair market value. And again, there's a very, very defined definition by the Appraisers Association of what fair market value is.
Well, thank you. I don't see any additional questions, so we'll wrap this up. Thank you, Mark. And to our attendees, we hope you enjoyed the information shared in this webinar. For more information about the association, please visit www.invrecovery.org. We also encourage you to make plans today and save the date on your calendar for our conference and trade show, April 19th through 22 in Scottsdale, Arizona. We will have 3.5 days packed with education specific to investment recovery and have more than 50 exhibitors who are dedicated to helping you gain more value for your surplus and idle assets. We look forward to your continued participation in the cross-industry learning opportunities and activities offered by the association. Our next webinar is an introduction to the CMIR certification program, and it will be on Wednesday, November 6th at 10:30 Central Time. Thanks again for your attendance, and have a great day.